Hey guys, welcome to this full narrative guide. So this is going to be a super in-depth guide, and once you watch this video, you will know everything you need to know about narrative. But if you're just looking for something specific, there will be timestamps in the description, so you can look in there if you have a more specific thing you want to find out. There will also be a download link to the project, so if you don't want to follow along, you can just download the project and try it out. You do need to have narrative installed for the project to work. But I promise you, if you watch this entire video and get through it all, you will be an expert with narrative. There will be no quest, no dialogue that you won't be able to make if you follow along here. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So if you haven't bought a copy of Narrative yet, the link will be in the description to grab it. And if you end up buying Narrative and you're not happy, I'll put my email on the screen and you can reach out and I will give you a refund. I fully stand behind Narrative. There's basically no mission or quest you can't make with Narrative. There's no dialogue you can't make with Narrative. It works with multiplayer games. It works with pretty much every genre of game. So I stand behind this product, and if you want a refund, definitely reach out and I'll give you your money back. Without further ado, let's begin the video. Alright, so if you purchase Narrative, it will be under Unreal Engine, Library, and then it will be in your vault, and you can just click on Install the Engine. I've already installed it to Unreal Engine 5, which is what I'm going to be using today, and we're going to go ahead and launch Unreal Engine 5. Okay, Unreal Engine 5 is open. I've made a new project called Narrative, and I'm just going to use a blueprint third-person project. So click on Create, and let's begin. Alright, so hopefully you see on your screen what I have here, third-person project. The first thing we need to do is go to Edit, Plugins, and then search for Narrative, and then Enable Narrative, and then it's going to ask you to restart your project, so just click this button that says Restart Now. Alright, so once you've restarted your project, let's just make a folder called Narrative that we're going to put all of our quests and dialogues and things like that in. Before I even get into quests and dialogues, I want to quickly touch on something called a narrative task. So if you right click, there's the narrative option there. And you have this thing called the narrative task. Basically, narrative works by tracking things that your player does. So, for example, you could have a narrative task called Find Item. And every time the player found an item, you would tell Narrative what the item was that was found. And Narrative will track any item the player's ever found ever. It uses this to make quests. For example, you could have a quest where the player needs to find some items, and because Narrative knows whenever the player is finding items, it will automatically track the quest for you. So these narrative tasks are very much the backbone of Narrative in a lot of ways. And so it's really up to you what tasks you want to make, right? But we're going to make one called Find Item. So every single time the player finds an item, this task will fire, and we're going to tell Narrative that the player found an item. If you open up the task, there is a bunch of information like the category of the task, a description of the task, the name of the task, but this isn't really that important for now. So I'm just going to go ahead and close this. Okay, so we're going to open up our third-person character here, and I'm going to add the narrative component to our character. And the narrative component is basically how you begin quests, begin dialogues, restart quests and dialogues. It's how you talk to the whole narrative system. The other thing that we're going to do is we're going to put the UI on the screen that comes with narrative. So when we start a quest or start a dialogue, we can actually see it pop up on our screen. So we're going to go to the event graph, search for begin play, and then we're going to drag out and type create widget. And we're going to select Narrative Default UI. And then just drag Narrative in, and then hook it up to Narrative Component. And then we want to put the UI on the screen, so we just have to do Add to Viewport. And that's all we have to do to put the Narrative UI on the screen. So let me show you how these narrative tasks work. If I right click above where it says Begin Play, I'm just going to type 1 and then add a keyboard event for 1. And when I press the 1 key, I'm going to take Narrative, and I'm going to search for a complete narrative task. So what this is this is telling Narrative that the player has done a task. And I'm going to click Find Item, that task that we just made. And you can see that the narrative task node, it's asking what was the item that we found. So let's just say to Narrative that the player found a sword, right? Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to press 2, and I'm going to add a keyboard event for 2. And if we drag narrative in, you can actually check how many times a task has been completed before. So if I click on find item and type in sword, narrative remembers how many times you've found a sword before. And this is actually persistent, meaning that if your player closes the game and opens it back up later on, narrative will still remember every time the player has found a sword, even if they found a sword years ago. So you can actually test this out, right? If I go into the game, I'm going to press the 1 key 3 times. And now if I press 2, you can see narrative is saying 3. In the top left-hand corner it says 3, because narrative remembers I found a sword 3 times before. So far you're probably thinking, big deal, right? Narrative is going to remember how many times my player has found a certain item. That doesn't really seem that groundbreaking. But these tasks are really important to how quests work. So what we'll do now is we'll go into our narrative folder, go to narrative, and then make a new quest. And I'm going to call this quest my first quest. You can call it whatever you want. We'll open it up. And in the quest graph, this is really, really important here. If we drag off of quest start, you can see that any tasks we've created actually come up. And there's a couple that come with narrative. But you can see we made that one called find item, and it's available here in the quest graph. If I click on find item, it's saying describe what the player needs to do to complete this task, right? So I'll just type find a sword. I'm going to expand the task thing here, and the task is to find an item, and the item name is sword. And then by default, it's going to add another state, but I'm actually going to delete that. I'm going to drag off, and I'm going to hit succeed the quest. So basically what we've just done here is we've made a quest with narrative. When you start the quest, you need to find a sword and it will succeed the quest. So it's a very, very basic quest, but quests can get a lot more complex than this, and I'll show you in a bit. But for now, let's just try out this new quest that we've made. So if I go back to the character here, after I add my UI to the screen, I'm going to begin that quest. And remember, the narrative component is how you talk to narrative. So I'm going to drag off and I'm going to type begin quest and tell narrative that I actually want to begin my quest. Make sure that in your quest you click compile. And then we're going to select my first quest. The other thing with the begin quest node is you can have as many active quests going at once. So if you call the begin quest function more than once, it will begin all of the quests and it will track them all at once. So you could have hundreds of quests running at any one time. And you can even do things like restart quests that are already in progress, or you can even remove quests from the player's quest list using forget quest. Check this out. If we hit play, you can see it says quest started, my first quest, and it's actually telling us we need to find a sword. And I've hooked the 1 key up to find a sword. So if I press 1, you can see it actually succeeded the quest. So very, very easy to get started with some basic quests. Okay, so I want you guys to go back into your character, go to the event graph, and then where it says 2, just go ahead and delete what we had, and then we'll just copy and paste this so that when you press the 2 key, it tells narrative that you found a bow. And then we'll compile and save. So we're going to modify this quest a couple times just so you guys can get the hang of how you actually create quests with narrative. So let's make a quest where you can actually fail it by finding a bow. So if we drag up from quest start and do find item, and then do bow as the item name, and we'll just say find a bow as the description. We'll delete this quest state and then drag out and click on fail the quest, right? And we might say quest failed, something like that. Make sure to compile and save your quest. Alright, so now if we hit play, we can either find a sword or find a bow. And if we press 2 and find the bow, it actually fails the quest. And if we press 1 and find the sword, it actually succeeds the quest. So that's a quest with a way to succeed the quest and a way to actually fail the quest. What if we wanted the player to have to find the sword and the bow? There are a couple of ways to go about this. So let's go ahead and delete this. And we'll go to where it says find item sword. And click the add multiple tasks button. And then just go to find item sword here. Click this little arrow and duplicate this. But then just change this to say bow. And then we'll change the description to find a bow. And then this main description here, I'm just going to say, find some weapons. Okay, we'll hit compile, save, and now if we hit play, our quest will tell us that we need to find some weapons, and it says find a sword, find a bow. Now if I press 2 and find the bow, you can see that task is finished, and now I need to find a sword, so I'll press 1, and you can see I've succeeded the quest. Okay, so we made it so you can find the sword and then the bow, or the bow and then the sword, but what if we want the player to have to find the items in a certain order? The easiest way to do that, let's just delete this, is we'll drag off from quest start, and we're going to say find item, and we'll type in bow, and then for the description we'll just say find a bow, and then here we'll say I found the bow, now I need to find a sword. Now all you need to do is drag out, find item, sword, and we'll say find a sword, and then I'm going to delete this quest state here, and I'm going to drag out and do succeed the quest. And for the description I'm just going to say quest complete. Okay, so now we have made a quest where you have to find the bow and then the sword. So if I hit play, you can see my new quest is telling me to find a bow. If I press 1, which finds the sword, it's not doing anything. But if I press 2 to find the bow, now it's telling me, hey, you need to find a sword. And now I can press 1, and now my quest has succeeded. So I had to do the steps in a certain order. Okay, we'll talk about persistent tasks later on in the video. But for now, I'm just going to drag over all of these. I'm going to hit C to add a comment, and I'm just going to say player needs to find a bow, then a sword. So you can add comments to explain how your quests work as well. So you're probably thinking, well, Ruben, in a real game, I wouldn't press 1 and 2 on my keyboard. I would have to go and find a bow and find a sword. So let's actually add some pickups that the player can take instead of pressing 1 and 2 on our keyboard. So I'm going to make a new actor. I'm going to call it BP_pickup. And I'm going to add a sphere collision. Just going to go down to collision presets and do overlap only pawn. Then I'm also going to add a text render component just so we can see what the item we're taking is. I'll go to horizontal alignment center. Alright, so let's go into the event graph and let's make it so that when the player walks into the pickup, it takes the pickup, right? So here's actor begin overlap. We want to get our player's narrative component, and you can do that really easily by using the get narrative component from target. This will take any actor and find the narrative component, and then just like before, we're just going to do complete narrative task, find item, then we're going to right click on the item's name and promote it to a variable. And then over here I'm just going to click this little I, and we will plug that in like that. Last thing, we're just going to go to the construction script. We're going to drag the text render in and do set text. And then you're going to drag in the item name and then hook it up like that. Also, after we tell narrative that we've taken the item, we're going to destroy the item. Last thing we'll do as well is add a rotating movement component to the pickup just so it looks a little bit nicer in the game. And then we're going to drag one of our pickups into the level here, and I'm going to type in sword for the item's name, and then I will copy and paste my pickup, make another one, and for the item name here, I'm going to type in bow. And so now when I jump into the game, instead of pressing 1 and 2 on my keyboard, we actually have some pickups we can take. So if I take the bow pickup, you can see that it's updated my quest, and now if I take the sword, you can see it actually succeeded the quest there. Okay, this is very important, right? So we have a pickup, and when the player takes the pickup, we tell narrative, hey, the player found an item, and we tell narrative what the item was. But it's important to know this could be anything. You could have an enemy, and when they die, it tells narrative that a certain enemy died and what that enemy was. Or you could tell narrative when the player discovers a location and what that location was. And then you can make really rich quests, right? You can make a quest where you have to go to a certain location, kill a certain enemy, and then take a certain item, and then bring it back to a certain person, right? The more tasks you make, the more complex quests that you can implement. So just to really drive home this point, let's go ahead and make another narrative task. and we'll call it go to location. So this is a task that's going to fire when the player goes to a certain notable location. So we're going to go ahead and go into our quest, and we need to find a bow, and then we need to find a sword. That's our quest, right? Let's make it so that we need to find the bow and then bring it to a certain location. So we're going to change find item sword. We're going to click on it, go to location instead, and now it's asking for a location name, not an item name, right? So we're going to get rid of sword, and we're going to say archery store, right? And we'll say go to the archery store. And then for the main description here, I'm going to say bring the bow to the archery store. And then we'll click on quest state here. And instead of saying I found the bow, now I need to find the sword, I'll say now I need to take it to the archery store, right? Make sure to compile and save that. Alright, next you want to go to blueprints and go to BP pickup and hit Control D to duplicate it. And we're going to call it BP underscore location. And the locations are not going to be very different from how the pickups work, but this is just to get you in the rhythm of using different tasks to build quests up. So we're going to change this to go to location. And then instead of it being called item name, I'm going to call it location name, right? And what we'll do is we'll take the location, and let's just pretend that the archery store is over here, right? There's an archery store, so we're going to drag this in. And for the location name, I'm going to put archery store. And I'm going to click on the sphere, and I'm going to make it way bigger. So we'll make it like that size instead, okay? We'll save that. So if we look at our quest, we have to find a bow, and then we have to bring the bow to the archery store now. So make sure to compile and save it, play, and so in the game it says find a bow, so we're going to go ahead and find a bow. We could even take the sword and you'll see it doesn't do anything. You have to find the bow, just like we designed it. And now it says bring the bow to the archery store, and we put the archery store over here, so we're going to go to the archery store. And you can see bring the bow to the archery store is complete. So I know that the location thing is quite similar to the pickups, but this is just to, you know, get you understanding. You can make multiple different tasks, and these are essentially the building blocks for your quests. Okay, so those are kind of the basics of how the quests work, and we can go more in depth with these later, but I think what I'll do is let's move over to the dialogues now. So we're going to right click, go to narrative, and make a new dialogue. And I'm going to call this dialogue Jeff. So this would presumably be for a character called Jeff that would be in our game somewhere. So we're going to open this up. We're going to go to the dialogue graph. So it's very similar to how quests work. You've got an event graph and you have a quest graph. Well, in dialogues, you have an event graph and you have a dialogue graph. The dialogue graph is pretty intuitive, right? So it's already added a line of dialogue for Jeff. And you can see it says, hey there, I'm Jeff. If we click on class defaults, you can actually expand the speakers here. And you can see Jeff is added as one of the speakers. And we could even give Jeff a color, like we could make him blue. This is quite handy later if you have like 10 different people speaking in a dialogue. Jeff will always be blue, so it's easier to tell who he is in the dialogue. So Jeff has a dialogue line, and what you can do is you can drag out and you could make Jeff say more dialogue lines. So if I click add dialogue line for Jeff, we might make him say something like, how are you? And so we'll compile and save this, and let me show you this dialogue actually working. We just have to open our character up, and then where we have begin quest, I'm just going to drag narrative in again, and I'm going to search for begin dialogue, and then I'm going to select our Jeff dialogue, and then compile and save. If we hit play, you can see it says Jeff, hi there, I'm Jeff, how are you? And then the dialogue ends, right? And the dialogue ends because Jeff no longer has anything else to say, so the dialogue will automatically end. But we could give the player some options, so we might choose to have the player say, I'm great. Or we might have the player be able to say, not so good. And I'll compile and save and play again. And you can see it says, hey there, I'm Jeff. How are you? And now we actually have a couple of options here. We can say, I'm great or not so good. And so this is pretty intuitive, right? If the player says, I'm great, then we could add a line for Jeff saying, great to hear. And if we say not so good, we could add a line for Jeff that says, sorry to hear that, right? So you can see how building dialogues is a fairly intuitive process, right? You may have noticed when you compile your GIF dialogue that you get all these warnings here saying that it's missing audio cues. And this is because by default, narrative actually plays audio when you're in a dialogue as well, but we don't have any audio selected, right? So it's actually warning us, hey, you're missing audio. And that can be useful in a real project where you don't want to forget to put audio in. But for our usage, it's kind of annoying. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Edit, Project Settings, and we can actually turn off those warnings by going down to where it says Narrative Dialogues Editor. And you can just turn off Enable Warnings and warn missing sound cues. And now, if you compile, it'll work just fine. Well, it works just fine anyway, but now it won't like warn you every time you try to compile the blueprint. So if we go to class defaults, I just want to show you really quickly, if you add an element to the speakers, we might add another speaker called Bob, for example. And so we could give Bob the color green. And so after Jeff says great to hear, we could add a line for Bob saying, by the way, I'm Bob, right? So you can add more speakers to a dialogue. So let's compile, save, and hit play. And we'll just make sure this is actually working. So Jeff, hi there, I'm Jeff. How are you? If we say I'm great, Bob says, by the way, I'm Bob. There we go. So you remember before how we had the quest where you had to get the bow and then you had to take the bow to the archery store. Well, what we could do is we could actually make a quest around that, right? So we'll click on Bob here. And he says, by the way, I'm Bob. Let's say I'm Bob, by the way. We run an archery store. And someone stole a bow. Can you try find it, right? And then the player will either be able to say, sure, I'll help. Or the player can decline the quest, right? The player can say, no thanks. So let's go back into our character and let's actually remove this begin quest node and we'll just connect up begin dialogue. So we're not beginning the quest anymore because I'm going to show you how to do something really cool here. So if the player selects sure I'll help, we want it to start the quest that we made, right? Well, the easiest way to do this is just to add an event. And you can make your own events, but there's a few that come with narrative. One of them is called Begin Quest. And if you use the Begin Quest event, you can give it the quest we made. And you can actually see it says here on this node, begins quest, my first quest. So basically, if I select this dialogue option, it will begin the quest. So let's actually compile, save, and we'll try this out, right? I'm going to hit play. You can see Jeff says, hi there, I'm Jeff. How are you? Say, I'm great. Great to hear. I'm Bob, by the way. We run an archery store and someone stole a bow. Can you try find it? And if we select sure I'll help, you can see it's going to start the quest. You can see quest started, my new quest, and now it's telling us to find the bow and then take it to the archery store, right? So quests and dialogues play really nicely with narrative. Instead of the dialogue just starting when I play the game, I'd rather that I have to walk up to like some sort of AI character and talk to him. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on our third person character and duplicate it, and I'm going to call it BP underscore NPC. So this is just going to be like an AI that we can talk to, and we'll drop him into the level and we'll open him up, and we need to get rid of these input events. We don't need those. And we'll also come to this begin play and remove that and remove the narrative component because this is our AI. So this doesn't need any narrative component. And we're going to add a sphere collision to the AI and we'll make it say 300. Again, same deal as before. We need to go to overlap only pawn. And then we're going to go into the event graph. And in the event graph, we're going to do begin overlap. So actor begin overlap. And we're going to get the narrative component from the player. And then we're going to begin dialogue. This time we actually do have an NPC actor. It is this actor. So we're going to do self. And then we're going to promote the dialogue to a variable. And again, click the I there as well. All right, we'll compile and save our NPC. And we're going to drag him into the level. I've already put one in the corner over here. And then there's an option for the dialogue. And I'm going to select Jeff as the dialogue. We'll open our character back up and get rid of begin dialogue. And now we should be able to actually walk up to this character and begin the dialogue that way. So let's try it out. You can see it's worked. Hi there, I'm Jeff. How are you? And if you press escape, it'll actually end the dialogue, by the way. To fix that weird bug with our character's foot, just click on the sphere. And then where it says overlap only pawn, you want to change it to custom. And then just do ignore for visibility. And that will fix that bug. I'm going to go ahead and run a new editor window here. And I'll run up to our AI. Hi there, I'm Jeff. How are you? We could say, I'm great. Great to hear. And then Bob starts talking. We haven't actually added a character model for Bob, though. How about we do that? And also, we did give the character a male name. So let's change the mannequin from Quinn to Manny. And I'm just going to click on the mesh and copy and paste it. And that can be our Bob character. So now we actually have like an NPC in the level that you can see, right? Jeff and this Bob character as well. So if we say, I'm great. You can also press enter to skip dialogue lines, by the way. So you can see I'm Bob, by the way. We run an archery store and someone stole a bow. Can you try to find it? So we can say, sure, I'll help. And same as before, right? We can do the quest. So let's go into some more advanced features here. Okay, so far we've got a character. Well, there's actually two there. We added an extra guy, Bob, into this dialogue. And he gives you a quest. But what if we want him to ask you, how's the quest going if you come back to him? Well, this is actually pretty easy to add. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the root node empty. And the reason is I'm going to use something called dialogue conditions. So we can change the dialogue basically depending on the state of the game, what's going on, right? So what we'll do is we'll drag out here and we'll add a line for Jeff. And we'll say, how's the quest going? Now, if we leave our dialogue like this, by default, the narrative starts at the top and works downwards. And so what's going to happen is if I walk up to Jeff right now, he's going to say, how's the quest going? Because narrative is going to start here and it's going to pick this one first. It's not going to pick this one, right? Unless we add some conditions. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a condition and we're going to say, is quest in progress my first quest? So he's going to say, how's the quest going? But only if this condition is met. And you can see the condition is actually displayed here. Is quest in progress my first quest, right? Now what we can do is we could add a player response and say, I still haven't found the bow yet. So let's go and try it out. If I walk up to them, they say, how are you? I can accept their request. And if I come back to them, they'll ask how the quest is going. And you can see that's working perfectly. I might even try add another line for Jeff. I might say, let's add a line for Bob, actually. Let's switch it up a little bit. We'll say, I heard you got the bow back to the shop. Good job. And we only want him to say that if you've actually succeeded the quest. So we're going to use another condition here, is quest succeeded, my first quest. And these are all of the conditions that come with narrative, but you can make your own custom conditions, and I'll show you how to do that later on in the video. So we're going to compile and save, and let's try the entire thing out now. How are you? I'm great. Great to hear. I'm Bob. We run an archery store. Someone stole a bow. We can say, sure, I'll help. And then we have to find the bow. We have to bring it back to the archery store. And then the quest is now succeeded. If I go back to these guys, they should remember that the quest is succeeded. I heard you got the bow back to the shop. Good job. So that's an example of a very, very basic quest and dialogue that sort of work together. Just to show you guys how the audio works, I've recorded myself saying, "How are you?" So I'm going to just import that into the project here. And then we'll open up the Jeff dialog, click on "How are you?" And then under dialogue sound, I'm going to select "How are you?" And you'll notice now that when I play the dialogue, Narrative will automatically play the audio for us. How are you? You can see, I don't know if that came through on your guys' end, but the audio played. You can also do things like select an animation for the player to speak, and then I'll also just show you alternative lines here. So you can actually add an alternative line. So we might say, "How are you?" And then we might also have an alternative line, "What's up?" And so what happens is, if you provide some alternative lines, there's a chance that Narrative will use one of these lines. So it adds a bit of variation into your dialogue. So if I walk up to Jeff enough times, he should actually say, "What's up?" How are you? So he said, "How are you?" There you go. And then he said, "What's up?" So if you provide alternative lines, it's just a way to add a little bit more randomness into your dialogues. So that's all that does. The other nice thing is, if you wanted Bob to say this line instead of Jeff, for example, you could simply click on this and then go to where it says speaker and simply just change it to Bob. And now Bob would be saying this line instead of Jeff. So what I think we should do is, instead of you having to find the bow and then take it over to the shop, let's make it so you have to find the bow and then actually take it back to Jeff and Bob instead of taking it to the shop. So how would we go about doing this? Well, it's actually not very difficult. Let's open up the Jeff dialog here. And what we'll do is we'll add an option for the player. And we'll say, "I have the bow right here." Now, we only want the player to be able to select this option if they actually have the bow. So how do we go about doing that? Well, if we open up our quest where you have to find the bow, after you find the bow, you'll be at this state in the quest, right? So this has an ID quest state 14 for me. I'm just going to change this to got bow. So change your ID for this to got bow. And now all you need to do is, for this option, just add a condition to it again. This time we're going to use a condition that comes with Narrative is quest at state. And so under options, just select my first quest. And then for the state, just type in got bow. And now you can see it says is quest at state got bow. So if the quest is at the state got bow, you'll be able to select the "I have the bow right here" dialog option. So if we play the quest, check this out. I'm going to go ahead and start the quest. And if I find the bow and I go back to Bob and Jeff, how's the quest going? And now I should be able to select "I have the bow right here." But selecting that option doesn't actually complete the quest, right? So how do I make it so that selecting that dialog option completes the quest? So if we go into our quest, you might have noticed at the start of the video when I dragged out, our find item and go to location tasks are there. But there's actually these ones that come with Narrative out of the box, one off task and play dialogue node. And play dialogue node is the one that we want. So let me show you how easy this is to use. So I'm going to change this. I found a bow. I need to take it back to Bob, right? And now instead of going to the archery store, I'm going to delete that. I'm going to drag out, and instead I'm going to click on play dialogue node. Okay, and I'll delete this quest state here. Right? I need to play a dialogue node. So if we go into the Jeff dialogue blueprint, I have the bow right here. We'll just give it the ID give bow, right? That's it. And now in here, where it says node ID, just type in give bow. Okay, so I know this play dialogue node is probably a little bit confusing, but just remember, like we had our pickup and our location, Narrative has its own one that it tracks, and it's just any dialogue node that you select, right? And so when you select a dialogue node with the give bow ID, it'll complete the quest. So that is all you need to know. I know it's a little bit confusing if you're brand new to this, but trust me, you'll be used to this in no time. So we'll start the quest. And we're going to find the bow. And it says, give the bow to Jeff and Bob. And now check this out. When I select the right dialogue option, which is this top option here, it's going to complete the quest. And it does. Check that out. So you can make the player have to select a certain piece of dialogue as a step in the quest, and that's exactly what we've done here. Okay, so now we're going to get a little bit more complex. We're going to talk about modifying how the dialogues work completely. Obviously, your game is not going to have the same dialogues as every other game. You're going to want to modify the dialogue system itself, and it's pretty easy to do. So we'll start off with a very basic modification. Let's inject the player's username into a dialogue. So instead of saying how's the quest going, let's add curly open bracket and curly closed bracket. And inside of it, we're going to put username. And then we'll put a little comma there. So username, how's the quest going? So I'm going to show you how to inject a bit of code into a dialogue option here. So we're going to go over to the event graph. We'll go to functions and override the getString variable function. And we're going to switch on string with the variable name. And we'll add a pin. So if the variable name is username, we could, for example, get the player state. We could get the user, in fact, get owning controller, get player state, and then get username, or get player name, I believe it is, yeah. And then we'll put that in like that, put that in there. Otherwise, we'll just do this. Okay. So now when we walk up to our friends here, if we start the quest, if I go up to them, they'll say, Ruben, blah, 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 how's the quest going? And they will say your actual username. So you can use blueprints to actually dynamically change the content of dialogues as well, which is pretty cool. But that's just the beginning of modifying how the dialogues work. So let's go back into the event graph. What I want to do is, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but when you walk up to these people, your camera doesn't change. It just stays where it is, right? What if we wanted to spawn in a nice camera here? So we'll search for camera actor and drag one into the level. What if we want to spawn in a camera that sort of views the dialogue, right? How do we do that? It's actually really, really simple. So I've put the camera where I want it. I'm going to copy this location here. And what we'll do is we'll go to functions, on begin dialogue, and on begin dialogue, we're actually just going to spawn in the camera. So camera actor. And then we'll promote the spawn transform to a variable. And then I'm just going to paste in where I wanted that camera to be. And the rotation for mine was 50. And then what we're going to do is we're going to get the owning controller and set the view target to the camera. And let's actually right click and promote that to a variable as well. We'll call this camera actor. So we can just drag in the camera actor and hook it up like that. So check this out. This is actually going to work pretty nicely here. If we talk to these guys, check it out. It's using this camera actor now for our conversation. The only problem is if we end the dialogue, it stays with this camera. It doesn't put me back into my player. To fix that, we need to go to override on end dialogue, and then on end dialogue, we're just going to set our view target back to the owning pawn, like that. And we'll also remember to destroy the camera actor because we don't want to spawn in a bunch of them. And so let's compile, save, play. How are you? It's going to go into our camera here. And then if we exit the dialogue, it puts us back into our player. So this is fine, but I'm not a huge fan of this, right? I'd prefer that the camera looks at whoever is talking rather than looks at everyone all at once. So how do we change the camera to look at whoever is currently talking? Again, we just have to override a couple more functions. We're going to override the onPlayer dialog line started function and also the onNPC dialog line started function. When the NPC starts talking, we're going to update the camera to look at the NPC, and same goes for the player, right? In order to know who to point the camera at, we need to click on our NPC actor here. We're going to click on the main one here. This is going to be Jeff. So just search for tag and then add a tag. And we're going to add the tag Jeff to this guy. And then we're going to click on this guy. And we're going to add the tag Bob to this guy. So this one's going to be Bob. This one's going to be Jeff. We're going to open up our Jeff dialog. And what we want to do is we want to point the camera at whoever is speaking, right? So let's make a function called point camera at player. And we'll add a variable here. I'm going to do skeletal mesh component object reference. And we'll call this mesh. Because we want to point it at the player's mesh, right? The mesh of whoever is speaking. So to do that, we're going to take the camera actor. And we want to put the camera actor in front of the mesh and then turn the camera around so it's like looking at the person. So I'm going to quickly write this code here. I'm not going to go super in depth here. If you know a bit of game development, you'll know what I'm doing. If you're new to this, I'm sorry, but I don't really want to explain a whole bunch of vector math. This is more to do with how to use narrative. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the forward vector. We'll go about 2 meters in front of the player. Going to get the world location of the mesh. We're going to add these values together. And by default, it's going to be down by their feet. So we actually need to add a little bit of height so it's at the player's face height, right? So let's do like 150. And so we're going to set the camera actor location and rotation. This is going to be our new location. And the rotation is just the forward vector turned around so the camera's looking at the person that's speaking. So we have to multiply the forward vector by negative 1. And then plug that into the rotation. And then plug that in like that. Okay, so now we have a function that will point the camera at a certain person. So when the player is talking, we want to get the owning pawn, which is our player. And then we're going to get component by class. Skeletal mesh component. And then point camera at the player, right? For the NPCs, it's a little bit trickier because there's actually 2 meshes. So we need to figure out who to point the camera at. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag off the speaker and break it. We're going to grab the speaker ID. So we'll get NPC actor, get component by tag, and we're going to use the speaker's ID as the tag. And then again, skeletal mesh component. We're going to get, and then we're going to do point camera at player. Compile, save. Let's try it out. I know this code probably seems super complex and intimidating if you're new to Unreal Engine, but trust me, if you just get a little bit of experience, this is not terribly tricky, but I know when you're learning, everything's pretty scary. Anyways, let's try it out. So you can see it's looking at Jeff. We're going to say, I'm great. Now it's looking at us. Great to hear. It should go over to Bob. Yep, when Bob starts talking, the camera looks at Bob. I might actually as well, instead of doing 2 meters in front of the player, I might just go for like 70. Just so it's looking a bit closer. Let's try that again. Yeah, I like that a little bit more. Right? So you can obviously modify this to however you want. You can change the FOV of the camera and things, but that's just a basic example of spawning a camera in and pointing the camera at whoever is speaking. And obviously this is just the beginning. The world's your oyster. You can really do as much modification to the dialogues as you want. Even stuff like playing the sound. You can override the play dialogue sound function. And let's say I want to play my sounds in slow motion. I can go down here and I can go to the pitch and pitch this way down. And now when people talk in a dialogue, they'll have very low voices. So, you know, right down to playing sounds and cinematics and things, you can really modify to your heart's content using blueprints. So we've spawned in a camera and we've pointed it at whoever is talking, and you can go further with this, of course, but what I'll do for now is I'm going to disconnect on begin and on end dialogue, and I just want to show you guys you can actually use sequencer to drive where the camera goes instead. And this is a better option if you're less familiar with how to code. So we can add a level sequence. I'm just going to put it in my narrative folder. I'm just going to call this my custom shot. And what we're going to do is click the create a new camera and set it as the current camera cut. And then just like move the camera to where you want it. Like maybe we'll put it here, right? And then go ahead and save that. And then if you open up your GIF dialog, you can click on any of the dialogue lines and actually assign a shot to them. So for example, when Jeff says, "How are you?" I can go to shot, I can select my custom shot, and Narrative will automatically play that sequence for me. So using the sequencer tool, check this out. How are you? You can see how are you, and the camera is using that custom shot. So that's a much simpler way to drive where the camera is if you don't want to write some code to spawn in a camera if you're a little bit less familiar with how blueprints work. But I will leave the download link to this project in the description so you can steal this code and modify it and do whatever you want with it. Last thing I want to quickly touch on here is another function, get line duration. So by default, Narrative will wait 25 letters per second until it moves on to the next line, or it'll wait for the audio to finish if you've selected some sound here, right? But if you don't like that, if you want to override how that works, what you can do is you can go to override, get line duration, and you could, for example, make every line of dialogue take 10 seconds to finish, regardless of what the text is or whatever. So you could do that if you wanted to. Or for example, you could even wait twice the length of the sound that was supplied. So you can take the duration of the audio, multiply it by 2, and now Narrative will wait twice as long as the audio to finish the dialogue line. So just as an example, I'll just show you. I'm going to set this as 10 seconds. So I'm going to set this to 10, and then if I play in the game, you'll see that every dialogue line takes 10 seconds now. Jeff says, "How are you?" Normally this would already have moved on to the next dialogue line, but because I overrided that function, it's waiting 10 seconds until it moves on to my options now. And if I say "I'm great," that will also last 10 seconds. Generally, I would recommend only override this sort of function if you know what you're doing, because you can kind of get into some trouble here. It's pretty hard to shoot yourself in the foot majorly, but if you're a total beginner, I would recommend staying away from this sort of thing unless you absolutely need it. So I'm going to get rid of the get line duration function. The other safer way to do it is if you go to Edit Project Settings and go down to Narrative, Dialogues, Gameplay, you can actually, it's supposed to say letters per second, by the way, that's a typo, but you can make the letters per second lower or higher, so you could give the player more or less time to read. And there's also this min dialogue text display time, so no matter how short a response is, Narrative will always wait at least 2 seconds at a minimum. So you could like bump this value up and say, I want stuff to stay on the screen for 15 seconds or whatever you wanted, right? Modifying these settings is generally going to be a lot safer than overriding stuff with Blueprint completely. But if you need more control, these functions here, you can always override them. And just to drive home how modifiable these dialogues are, let's open our Jeff dialogue up, and let's say, like by default, Narrative is going to put the UI on the screen and it's going to like play some audio and whatever. Let's say we don't want it to do that at all. What you can do is go to the event graph, override the play NPC dialogue, and now it's not going to play the audio or the montage or whatever. It's going to let you have full control over how you want to play an NPC dialogue line. So in my case, let's just, as an example, let's just print it onto the screen. So now, even if I have audio selected or whatever, it's not going to do any of that. It's going to do this instead. So you can completely override how a line of NPC dialogue is played. Let me show you what this will do. It will now display in the top corner of the screen, the dialogue line, you can see up there, it says, how are you? Now, the UI is still functioning, because I did put the UI on the screen. The UI is always going to listen to what's going on. But it's not going to play any audio. It's not going to play any dialogue shot. It's only calling my custom code and putting the NPC line at the top of the screen there. So if you had like something really custom you wanted to do, you can literally just completely override how a line of NPC dialogue is played. And if you wanted to, you could do the same thing for the player lines as well. So you have complete control over what happens. All right, I'm going to delete those and we'll move on to the last real big thing that you guys need to know. So in this dialogue here, I spawn in a camera and I point it at whoever's talking. And that's awesome. But if I create a new dialogue, so let's go to narrative, dialogue, and make one called Mark, for example. I'm going to open this up, compile and save it. Let's click on our guys here. And we'll go to where it says dialogue and select our new dialogue, Mark. Well, there's going to be a problem. If we go and talk to Mark here, it says, hi there, I'm Mark. All of that code we wrote that points the camera at whoever's speaking and all that good stuff, it's not working anymore. That's because the code that we wrote is in the Jeff dialogue. It's not in the Mark dialogue. To fix this, we can open up our Mark dialogue, go to class settings, and then search for Jeff. And use Jeff as the parent class. And what that'll do is it'll fix it. Now it's going to spawn a camera and it's going to point it at wherever, right? Okay, sweet. But it's kind of annoying. You don't want to have to remember to go to class settings and change the parent class. The better way to do it, go to edit, project settings, and then go down to narrative dialogues editor. And where it says default dialogue class, change it to your master class, which in my case is Jeff. I'm actually going to go to my Jeff dialogue and I'm going to rename it to master dialogue because this is going to be my main master dialogue that all the other ones are based off of. And so if I make a new dialogue here, I'm going to call this one Nick. If I open Nick up, you'll see up in the top here it says parent class master dialogue. So now any new dialogues that I make will automatically have my master dialogue, the Jeff one, as their parent class, and that way they'll all use the camera logic. And so if we click on one of our guys and go to those tags and change it to be Mark and save, now it should work just fine. It should point the camera at that guy. Yep, there you go. Hi there, I'm Mark. So that's what you want to do with your parent classes. Make sure you have one set and it'll use that for all of your dialogues. So you guys remember before we added an event to the Sure I'll Help option so that when you select Sure I'll Help, it begins the quest for you. And we used a narrative event to do that. Well, now I'm going to show you how to make your own custom narrative events because you'll probably want to do this at some point. Okay, so to make a custom narrative event, let's make a custom narrative event that opens a given level, right? So super easy to do. Let's go to Blueprints, Blueprint class, search for narrative event, and then select that as the parent class. And we're going to call this NE_open map. When you open up your narrative event, there are two functions to override. Execute event is what you want to do when the event gets run. And then get graph display text is the text that shows up in the dialogue editor. So let me just show you. See how it says begins quest, my first quest? Well, you have to code what it says there. So I'll show you all of this. Let's start by going to execute event. I'm going to do open, or let's do console, execute console command. For the world context object, we can just use like the pawn, for example. And then we're going to do a string append here. I'm going to say open and then a space. And then I'm going to right click on B and promote to a variable. And I'm going to call it map name. And then click on the I here. Very important. And we'll plug the controller into a specific player as well. And then click on the little checkbox to return true. And then the second thing we're going to do is go to get graph display text. And let's just drag out and do a format. It's actually just right click anywhere and do format text. And we're going to say opens level curly brackets, map. Drag in your map name, connect that up to map, and then go like that. And now we've made our very first custom narrative event. So if I go to, let's just do a little test here, right? I'm going to add a dialogue option for the player. I'm going to say, take me to a new map. And I'll add a event, and you can see our new open map event is here. And if I expand the options, you can see map name is an option. So we can give it a map name. So let's make a new level really quick. I'm just going to go to File, New Level, Open World, I suppose. And we'll click on Create. And then we're going to go to Save Current Level As. I'll just put it in my narrative folder. I'm going to call this Open World. We'll go to that take me to a new map, and where it says map name, I'm going to type in open world. And you can see that the way we've coded it, it says opens level open world. So we've successfully coded our first narrative event. Let's actually see if this works. So we'll go back to our original level. So we'll go back to our original map, third person map. I need to change the dialogue back to the mastered one. And I'm going to put the tag back to Jeff. Let's go ahead and talk to these guys. How are you? And if I select take me to a new map, you can see, hopefully, it'll actually take us to the open world map, and it does. So you can see that's working perfectly. Very cool. Okay, so next up we're going to have a look at custom narrative conditions. These are very, very similar to implement. So you want to go to Blueprint class. You're going to search for narrative condition. Select that. And I'm going to call this NC underscore check level. So let's say that in your game, your player has a level. This is pretty common, right? If you have like an RPG game or something like that, your player is probably going to have like a level. So we'll open up our character here, third person character, and I'm going to add a variable to our character called level. And I'm going to change that to be an integer type. And by default, you're going to be level 1, okay? And so let's go back to our narrative folder, and we'll open up our NC check level condition. And it's very similar to how the event works. You just override these functions. And you need to return a boolean saying whether or not the condition passed or not. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our pawn, we're going to cast it to a third person character, and then we're going to get the level of your player. And we're going to check, oh, we want the variable that we added, right? And we're going to check that the player's level is greater than or equal to, and then we're going to promote this to a variable, and we'll call this required level. And that is going to be the value that we return. So basically, we're just checking if the player's level is greater than the required level. So we're going to compile, save, and then we'll click that little I there as well. Very important. And then we're going to go to the graph display text. And again, we're going to do a very similar thing as we did before. We'll use a format text, and we're going to say level is greater than curly brackets level. And then we're going to plug in the required level, and we're going to plug that in like that. So now what we can do is we can go back to our master dialog, and let's say that the player is only allowed to ask to go to the new level if they have a high enough level themselves, right? So we're going to add a condition, and you can see now the check level condition has become available, and we can set required level to be 5. So now you can see it says level is greater than 5. So basically, you're only going to be able to say, take me to a new map if your level is greater than 5. And I actually set the player's level to be level 1. So you're not going to be able to select this option. Let's actually try it out and make sure this works. How are you? And you can see that we do not have the option to go to the new map because we don't have a high enough level. But if I go back into our player here and set our player's level to be, say, level 10, compile and save, I'll hit play. And now the option should be available because our player actually does have a high enough level. You can see now the option is available. To expand upon this further, you could actually have the player say, take me to a new map, and you could add a line for Jeff that if you have a high enough level, so you need level 5, we'll say, sure thing, and we'll add our open map event that we made, open map. We're going to select open world. So if the player does have a high enough level, Jeff's going to say sure thing and he's going to open the level. Or if you don't have a high enough level, let's say you need to be at least level 5. Your level is, and then we'll do curly brackets and we'll put level inside of the curly brackets, right? And we'll add a condition to this and we'll say check level. Oh, actually, we don't need to add a condition to that. Now, let's go back to the event graph because I used some curly brackets, so I need to add my variable for that. So we're going to go to functions, get string variable, and we'll just add a pin to the switch here. We're just going to type in level. We're going to take our owning pawn. And we're just going to grab the player's level. So cast to third person character. Get the level. Whoops. Get the level. And then we're going to add a return node and plug the level in like that. Okay. So let's put the player's level back to level 1 and try this out. So if I talk to Bob and Jeff, he's going to say, how are you? If I say, take me to a new map, you need to be at least level 5, your level is 1. So you can see it's working perfectly. And if I change my player's level to be, say, level 10, now we should be able to go to the map. So let's try this out. Take me to a new map. And he says, sure thing, because we have the required level, right? And now it's going to take us to our open world map. So there you go. I hope you're beginning to enjoy just how smooth it can be to work with this plugin. I know there's a bit of a learning curve, but once you sort of get these core concepts down, you can start to really prototype quests pretty quickly. So something that's really cool about Narrative is that out of the box, it actually remembers every line of dialogue that's ever been said. And this is super handy because your NPCs can remember if they've already told you stuff. They can remember if your players told them something before. And I want to show you how to implement that sort of behavior. So let's make it so that if you ask Jeff to go to the new map more than once, he's going to say, I already told you, you need to be at least level 5. So he's going to remember that you already asked him. So I'm going to show you how easy it is to actually do something like this. So let's go ahead and, I want to show you one more thing as well. We sort of did this with the start here, but you can use empty nodes for routing your dialogue. So I'll show you a little bit about how to do that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to disconnect this one here, and I'm just going to add an empty node for Jeff, just so that I can route this a little bit easier. So I'm going to give this one an ID, need level 5, okay? That's going to be the ID of this dialogue line here. And then we're going to add that I already told you dialogue line, right? So we're going to say, I already told you you need to be at least level 5. You are only level, and then we'll do curly brackets level. Remember? Okay, so how do we get Jeff to say this line if he's already told you this line before? Well, it's actually really, really simple. So this has the ID need level 5, right? Simply add a dialogue condition, or a narrative condition, sorry. Has completed task. Remember, narrative has a play dialogue node task that it comes with. So it already remembers. Remember, anything that's a narrative task, narrative remembers it. It remembers every item you've ever found, every dialogue line you've ever played, every location you've been to, whatever you have as a narrative task. And so it remembers every dialogue node you've played. So if we take the ID, need level 5, and then we chuck it in here, that should work. So what we're saying is, and we'll move this one above this one. So what we're saying is, right, take me to a new map. If your level is greater than 5, he'll do it. But if your level is not greater than 5, it's going to choose this one instead, right? And because it's empty, it's going to automatically skip over it, go here, and now it's going to say, have we played this dialogue node before? If we have, he's going to say, I already told you, right? Otherwise, he's going to tell you for the first time. So you can start to create some pretty complex dialogue features here. This should work fine, by the way. I know this play dialogue node thing, admittedly, it can be kind of confusing. But once you understand that any of these narrative tasks, narrative remembers them basically forever, you can select any task. So for example, instead of like play dialogue node, you could make him say this if you had a certain item or if you'd been to a certain location. So think about how powerful that is. Narrative remembers anything your player has ever done, and dialogues have full access to that information at any time. So it allows you to make some really rich, really believable dialogues. But I know there's a bit of a learning curve there. This concept is a little bit confusing. But anyways, I think you guys will get the hang of it. Let's compile and save and try this out. Before we try this, we actually need to open up our character. And we need to put the level back to level 1. We'll compile, save, and hit play. Okay, Jeff's going to say, how are you? I'm going to say, take me to a new map, and he's going to say, you need to be at least level 5, your level is 1. Now, let's go back to him, and because of how narrative works, he's going to remember that he already said that to you, and we're going to change his dialogue line. Check this out. How are you? Take me to a new map. I already told you, you need to be at least level 5. You're only level 1, remember? So the ability to check every line of dialogue the player has ever done, or every item that the player's ever found, you know, very, very useful. Just to give you guys a little bit more practice with this concept, because I really want to drive this home. It's super important, right? Let's just give you another line here just to help you practice this. So when Jeff says, how are you? We're going to drag out and add a line for the player. And we might have it so the player can say, I found a sword. But we only want you to be able to say, I found a sword, if you've actually found a sword. Well, all we need to do is add a condition, has completed task, and remember, narrative remembers any task the player has ever done. So we select find item, sword. Our dialogue is going to check if you've ever found a sword, and if you have, this option will be available. So let's try it out. We're going to compile and save. We're going to jump in here. How are you? You can see we can't tell them that we found a sword. But if we go and actually find the sword item, now narrative remembers we've found a sword, and our dialogue is going to represent that now. I found a sword. It appears as a dialogue option. So these narrative tasks are really, really quite important and super, super useful. The other thing is, you remember how I told you that narrative remembers narrative tasks. So it remembers anything the player has ever done because it saves it to disk. So it's all persistent. If you close the game and come back later, narrative will still remember that you found a sword before, for example. Well, out of the box, this actually won't work. So if I take the sword, right, and I go and talk to our friends over here, I can tell them that I found a sword. But if I close the game and I open it back up, the sword is still there. And not only that, if I go up to these guys, I can't tell them I found the sword. So narrative actually hasn't remembered that I found the sword. So what's going on there? The answer is really simple. You just have to load the data back in. So on begin play, I'm going to take my narrative and I'm going to call the load function, and it will load narrative back in. And then on end play, call the save function, and this will save all of your narrative data when your character ends play. So we'll compile and save, and now if we find a sword and then close the game and come back in, he'll still remember that we found the sword. See, I found a sword, so narrative has remembered it. You just have to call save and load yourself. The other thing is, well, if I've already found a sword, the sword shouldn't be there anymore, right? So how do you get the world to remember that you found the sword? Well, That is also pretty easy to do. This is a little bit more game specific, but generally the easiest way to do it is to open your pickup up, and we'll just do a simple implementation here. We're on begin play. We're going to get the narrative component. This will just get the player's narrative components. This is to be used in single player games. And assign on load complete. What we're going to do is if you've found the sword, don't spawn the sword in, right? It's that simple. So has completed task. Find item. We're going to plug the item name in. And then we're going to use a branch. And if you've already found the item, destroy it. So now, when we load our game in, it's going to call this function, and it's going to say, hey, you've already taken the sword, so we'll destroy it. So I'm just going to show you now that this works. When I hit play, the sword will not be there. There you go. It's not there. Because what happened is the sword saw that we'd already taken it, and it despawned itself. And the same will work with the bow. If I take the bow and then close the game, and then hit play again, you'll see the bow's no longer there. So my pickups are now remembering that I've actually taken them before. Alright, the next thing we're going to talk about is modifying Narrative's UI. And it's not that hard to do. You do need to know how to work with UI in Unreal Engine. But go to Settings here in your content browser. Make sure Show Engine and Show Plugin Content is enabled. And then you want to go to Engine, Plugins, and then find Narrative Content. Open that up. And then in the Narrative UI folder, go to Widgets. And these are all of the pieces of the UI that come with Narrative out of the box for you. A Narrative default UI is the one we're going to open up. And this is the UI, and you can easily modify it. So for example, if we click on NPC name text, the text is empty, but if I type in Jeff, you can see that's it right there, right? So say I want to change the color of the NPC name. I just do that. I'm going to set that back to be empty for now. We'll compile and save this. And now if I hit play, their names should be purple. So there you go. That's how easy it is to modify the UI. Let's change that back to white. Now, if you want to do more complex modification of the UI, then you're going to have to know some blueprints. You're going to have to know some UMG. And simply just go into the event graph here. And you can see it's all here. So if you want to change how the dialogue UI works, it's in here. Here's all the code, right? This code displays the player's responses. This code disables all the replies. You know, it's all pretty well commented. So if you know what you're doing, you should be able to add the features you want. But if you're a total beginner, you're probably not going to be able to modify the UI straight away. You're going to have to learn how to work with UI first. Or say you didn't want the player's dialogue to come up on the screen. Well, here's where we're putting the player's dialogue on the screen. If I hold Alt and click and disconnect that, what I can do is I can play it, and check this out. My player's dialogue is not going to be on the screen. If I say something here, I'm great. See, it does not say anything on the screen. It did not say I'm great, right? So you can obviously modify the UI, but you're going to have some knowledge of UMG. Something I also forgot to show you guys before is where Jeff says, how are you? If we go to I'm great, for the option text, we'll put like happy. And then here for the option text, we'll put sad. So the option text allows you to have a different piece of text for the option than the actual line itself. So I'll show you what I mean by that. You can see it says happy and sad, right? So if I select happy, he says, our player says, I'm great, right? So the option text just allows you to provide some different text for the option. Last thing I'm going to really quickly touch on is we've covered most of these options, right? When you click on a dialogue node, you can set some text, you can set a dialogue sound, a dialogue montage, all of this stuff, right? But what if you want to add extra properties, right? What if these are not enough? What if you want to add like a reputation so that certain dialogue lines give you some reputation or some XP if you select them? Well, super easy to do. Let's go ahead and add this in, right? So I'm going to right click, blueprint class, and I'm going to search for dialogue node player, and I'm going to call it BP my custom player node. And then simply add any extra properties you want. So I'm going to add a rep float. And make sure to click the little eye here. And then you have to go to Edit, Project Settings, Narrative Dialogues, Editor, and then where it says Default Player Dialogue class, you need to change this to your custom one. Now, once you do that, any new player nodes that you add, so if I drag out and add a player response, have a rep option. So I could say, you seem like a cool guy. And that would give you 100 reps. So if we type that in, now we've added a custom field to the dialogue here. And to give the player the rep, we would go into our character here. We would add a variable. I'm going to call it rep. It's going to be a float variable. And in your dialogue, we would just go to like on player dialogue line started. We're going to cast the node to the custom one that we made. We're going to grab the rep from it, and then we're going to get the owning pawn. We're going to grab our player's rep. Actually, we're going to do set rep. And we're going to set the player's rep to their current rep plus the rep that the dialogue node had. And just to show you this actually working, let's add a print string. Format text. You now have curly brackets, rep, rep. And then we'll plug the rep in like that. So if we compile and save, if I select the You Seem Like a Cool Guy dialogue option, you now have 100 reps. So you can see that selecting that dialogue option actually gave us more rep. And you could go wherever you wanted with this. Like you could make it so the player can only ask to go to a new map if they have enough reps. So you'd have to make a custom condition for that. And then, you know, the player would have to do this line to get enough rep. And then once they had enough rep, they could then go to the new map. So like, you can hopefully start to understand like how easy it is to prototype out these systems and features. The only downside is with your custom player node, make sure to get it set up very early in your project. You want to make a custom node as soon as possible because all of your old ones don't have rep. See, these are still the old ones. It's only after you set it, any new player lines you have will have the new custom class assigned. So ideally, set up your custom classes really early in your project, because otherwise you're going to have to like delete all your old player lines and re-add them. By the way, if you're ever testing your game and you want to delete the saved narrative data, all you need to do is just don't load your save back in. And when it saves, it'll save an empty save. So if you hit play, and then play again, you can see that the sword and stuff are spawning back in. Because we didn't load our game and then saved our game without having loaded anything back in, the save we created was empty, and so we wiped our save data. So I've wiped my save data because I want to show you something. We're going to hook load back up, compile and save. And I'm going to hit play, and I'm going to go ahead and talk to our friends here, and I'm going to start the quest. So I'm great to hear. Sure, I'll help. And then find a bow, right? Okay, so narrative remembers where your quests are at as well. Not only does it save everything you've ever done, it saves all of your quest progress. If I close the game here, so if I walk up to these guys, they ask me like how the quest is going and stuff. Well, if I close the game and open it back up, they still remember that I'm doing the quest. Because remember, anything within the narrative system is all saved to disk. It's all persistent. So these guys are going to remember that we're still doing their quest. But let me show you one more thing. I'm going to delete my save again by unhooking that. So I'm just going to wipe my save. And I want to show you guys something. Here's another feature. So if we hit play, right, if I take the bow and then start the quest, what do you guys think is going to happen? Sure, I'll help. It's saying I need to find a bow. Narrative isn't recognizing that I've already found the bow, so how do we do that? Well, if we open our quest back up, it's actually really easy. We're going to click on the Find Item Bow task, and if you check this box that says Retroactive, you can see, should it count if the player has already done this task in the past? So Retroactive is such a cool feature. If you turn this on, it will already count. So I'm going to wipe my save again. We're going to disconnect that and play the game. If I find the bow and then talk to these guys, watch what happens. This is pretty cool. Take the bow to Jeff and Bob, because narrative already realizes, hey, you already found the bow, so you can just bring it back to Jeff and Bob. So the save system, super powerful, and obviously retroactive tasks as well. Just super useful together. How's the quest going? I have the bow right here. There we go. Let's hook our load back up. Narrative also has a really basic quest journal. I sort of just made it just to kind of have it there because a lot of people wanted to know how to make one. It's really not the greatest, but let's make it so that when you press the 3 on your keyboard, it opens the quest journal up. So to open the quest journal, you just have to create widget, and the one that comes with narrative is called quest journal. So you just take narrative, plug it in like that, and then add it to the screen. And that's it. It's very simple to hook up. And so, because I'm loading everything back in, let's hit play. If I press 3, you can see my new quest is already finished. Because narrative not only saves everything the player has ever done, it saves every quest you've ever done as well. So when I open the journal, narrative already knows, hey, you've already finished this quest. And of course, just like the rest of the UI, you can really easily modify the quest journal to fit your game by opening it up. It's actually really simple. The quest journal is not a very complicated piece of UI. It's just going to get all of your in-progress quests, failed and succeeded quests, and then just put them in a box. That's all it does. It's actually pretty simple. Now let's talk about modifying quests. So a lot of the time you might have like a quest, and when the player gets to a certain point in the quest, maybe you want to spawn a new group of enemies in that try and take the player down. Or maybe when you get to the end of a quest, a plane comes and rescues your character, right? Usually you want to script quests as well. And so because quests are blueprints, it makes them really easy to do some scripting. So let's add a very basic example of some scripting to the quest that we already have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the BP pickup that we made earlier. And all I'm going to do is click on the item name here and then check the expose on spawn box. And we'll compile and save. What I'm going to do with my quest is when you start the quest, I'm going to spawn the bow in. So the bow is not going to be in the world. And a lot of the time you'll want to do this anyway. Like if you have a game, you generally don't want the item to be there until the quest starts. And then you spawn the quest item in, right? There's no reason to let the player get it before the quest starts. So let's open our quest up. And we're going to go to the event graph and override the onQuestStarted function. And now, super simple. We just spawn actor from class, pick up, bow. And I'm going to put mine about here. So for my coordinates, we're going to promote the spawn transform to a variable. And then I'm just going to use this location. You can figure out whatever location you want to use. Or you could just use the one I've used here. And we will, I guess we could promote this to a variable. It doesn't really matter, but we can if we want to. Then we'll compile and save. And so now the bow will not be there until we actually start the quest. So let's show this working. Ah, it saved my game. Let's wipe our save. We'll go to our character, remove our save here. And let's try this out. Now, so when I start the quest, it'll spawn the bow in, and you can see that has happened perfectly. So that's another way to work with quests, to script things to happen. You could literally do whatever you wanted. You could spawn new characters in, spawn new items in, destroy parts of the level during a quest. And I think it's pretty common too that you would want to have your world change as a quest happens, right? Maybe you want to play a cutscene when the player gets to a certain point of the quest. The point is the world's pretty much your oyster because this is Blueprints. You can do almost anything in Blueprints. You can override your quest so that if you get to this point in the quest, maybe it spawns in something, right? You can just get the ID, and if it's equal to got bow, then we could do something, right? I don't know, but let's just put hello on the screen as an example. Now when I take the bow, you can see it says hello in the top left-hand corner of the screen, but that could be anything. It could be playing a cutscene, whatever you want to do. You could also go to on quest succeeded, for example, and you could take the owning player and you could give the player some XP or some rep for completing the quest, right? If we succeed the quest, maybe I give my player 500 rep for doing the quest, right? So we could come in here and give myself some more rep. We could even have a variable quest rep. So each quest could have a certain amount of rep that it gives your player when you complete the quest, right? So we would just do this here and then add like that. So the quest could give you 500 rep when you complete it, for example. So you can easily give the player rewards when they complete the quest. Or, for example, you could punish the player and remove some rep if they failed the quest. Stuff like that as well is very easily achievable here. I'll also just really quickly touch on a couple of other good to know things. So we have put our narrative component on our character. Now, in your game, I would highly recommend putting it on the player controller instead. The reason for that is that if in your game your character dies and needs to be respawned or whatever, since the narrative component is on your player, if you remove the player and respawn it, it'll restart all your quests and everything like that. So you don't really want to put it on your character or your pawn. It's a better idea to put it on your player controller. The other thing you need to know is that narrative is fully networked, which is really cool. And using it in a networked game is almost the exact same as not in a networked game. The only thing is it's server authoritative, right? So if you're going to begin a quest, the server needs to call begin quest, and then it will begin it for both itself and the client. It replicates to the client. So only call begin quest on the server. Same goes for like restart quest and even complete narrative task. It's all server authoritative. That's what this little server icon is saying. It's saying only call this on the server. If you call it on the client, it won't do anything. I think people have had some success using the save game system in multiplayer games and networked games, but I can't vouch for this as I haven't done it myself. But theoretically, I don't see why it wouldn't work if you saved the player's game on the server, and for the save name, I would just use the player's username. I don't see why you couldn't load it back in, but I haven't done a lot of testing with this myself. One of the things that it does work, but I'd like to get it a bit more polished, but it is sub-dialogues. So if I open up the master dialogue here, you can see that this part is getting pretty messy, right? And so it can be nice to move this into sort of sub-dialogues. So what I'm going to do is I have my master dialogue here. And what I'm going to do is I will close this, and I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to call it Jeff_how are you. And if we go into that, we're going to remove everything from the event graph, and we're going to remove all of this stuff here, right? We just want this part, right? And I'm also going to go to class settings and use the master dialogue as the parent so that we have all the cool camera stuff and all that good stuff. We'll delete all the variables. Okay, we've now moved this into its own dialogue. And so if we go back to our master dialogue, we can actually delete all of this. Well, actually, we'll delete all of it except for this one. The reason we're going to keep this one is because we're going to add an event to it, start dialogue. And the dialogue to start is Jeff, how are you? So look at how much we've tidied that dialogue up by simply moving all of this stuff into here. I'm going to remove the how are you part because it doesn't matter. He says how are you in the master dialogue. And this is actually one of the tiny bugs, is you have to have some text on the node, otherwise it won't run this event. So if you just leave this empty, it actually won't run this event. But that's a pretty small bug, and I'll have that fixed as soon as possible. It's not going to be a difficult thing to fix. But for now, when you're following this tutorial at least, make sure that you put some text, otherwise it won't run that event. So if we compile, save, and try this out, should work just fine. So how are you? You can see, there you go, how are you? It's working, right? It's in its own separate dialogue. Let's say I'm great. Great to hear. So yeah, the dialogue functions exactly as it normally should. But we have tidied up our dialogue a lot. The last thing, I don't know how I forgot to mention this, but you can go backwards in dialogues, right? In fact, it's encouraged, right? If you want to make a looping dialogue, you can do that. And so if we say not so good and Jeff says sorry to hear that, I want the player to be able to choose from these options again. To do that, all I have to do is just go back like that. And so now if the player says not so good, they'll get all of these options again, right? So let's actually try that out, by the way. I just want to make sure that works. So let's say not so good. Sorry to hear that. And there you go. So we can actually select these options again. Hey guys, so I just finished recording all 1 hour and 30 minutes of this, and I've forgotten just a couple of really quick things, so I just want to get them in here. If you open up the quest and click on class defaults, you can change the name of your quest. And also the description isn't really used anywhere in the UI, but you could if you wanted to. But that's how you change the name of the quest, is just click on class defaults. And the other one is before, I briefly touched on how you can use sequencer to drive shots. So for example, I could select my custom shot here, and when this dialogue line plays, it's going to use the sequence that I gave it. You don't have to assign it per dialogue line. In fact, if you go to class defaults and then go to your speakers, I can actually define a shot for Jeff himself. So any lines spoken by Jeff will use this shot, but you can still override it per shot. So I just want to throw that in there. And then also player talking shot, you can put one in there, and also select reply shot to play when you're selecting your reply. Is also available. So there's a lot of different ways you can actually get narrative to play the sequences. And then also all of the shots have shot settings. So if you want to sort of change how the shots work, maybe you want to pause when you get to the end of it, or, you know, just whatever, you know, loop the shot, whatever you want to do, you can do that by changing the settings as well. The other thing I'm going to do is, before we close the video out, I just want to show you some more of what you can do with the narrative component. So whenever you begin a quest, it will add it to your active quests. If you want to get the player's active quests at any time, you can just do get all quests, right? You can also get the in progress quests. You can get any quests that the player has failed, and you can loop over them. You can get the current state of the quest. You can get the description. You can get the ID. This is really useful if you want to make your own UI. It's really easy to read the quests and read the states of them and everything like that. So you can do that really easily just through the narrative component. And then if you click on the narrative component, you also have a bunch of events here. So if you want to do something when the player succeeds a quest, you can add an event for that here by clicking on the component and then overriding an event here. So yeah. There's a lot that you can do with the narrative component, and if you want to see all of the functions, just drag narrative in, and you can see here under quests, if you expand it, you can basically see all of the different things that you can do here. And then there's also a dialogues section as well, and you can see all the different stuff you can do with dialogues. One thing that I actually didn't touch on is the concept of shared quests. So if you have a networked game, perhaps you have a teammate or teammates and you want to do the quest together. Well, it's actually possible for a group of players to share the same narrative component. You could have like 500 players share the same narrative component and all work on like the same quest. There's no real limit. And I want to show you how this works. Now, quests can be shared between multiple players. Dialogues cannot. There's no such thing as a team dialogue. Dialogues will always happen with your local player. So I'm going to show you how this works. We'll open up the third-person character here. And you can see that my player has a narrative component. So this is my player's narrative component. The team will have a separate narrative component that we all share. And your narrative component can be used to start solo quests, to start dialogue, but then our team component will have our team quests. So just because a bunch of people are sharing a quest doesn't mean that each player can't have their own solo quests they're doing as well. They can. So let me show you how to do this. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a blueprint class actor, and we're going to call it BP_team. And generally you would have this in your game. You'd have like some sort of squad or some sort of team actor that holds all of your teammates, right? So all we're going to do is add a narrative component to our team actor here. Make sure to click on the team and make sure it's replicated. And we're going to rename this to team narrative comp. Okay, so I'm gonna rework our begin play a little bit here. So just follow what I'm doing, and you should have yours working as well. So we're gonna get all actors of class, and we're gonna get the team actor, right? And we're gonna get the team narrative component from the team actor. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna take our narrative component. So this is our player's single player narrative component. This is our own personal one. And we're going to actually set shared narrative component here. And we're going to set it to the team one. So this is a little bit hard to wrap your head around if you're new to this. But this is our player's solo narrative component. This is our player's team narrative component. Every player that comes into the game is going to share this narrative component because any player that spawns in is going to grab that team actor and then set the shared component. In a real game, your teams might work a little bit differently to this, but the concept is the exact same. You just need to set the shared narrative component. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to delay for a second just to let that propagate to the client. In a real game, you probably wouldn't do this. This is just for example's sake. And then if you're locally controlled, we're going to put the UI on the screen. So we've modified our begin play a little bit. It's a little bit different for a networked game here. We're going to compile and save. And yeah, so now anyone that spawns in will share a narrative component with the other players in the game. So if we go to the dots here and we do 2 players and players client, everything should still work, right? You can still start dialogues and all that sort of stuff. But these 2 players actually have a team narrative component. So the players in the game here can do a quest together. So let me show you that this actually works. If we open up the BP team actor on begin play, I'll just wait, say, 5 seconds. So we'll use a delay node to wait 5 seconds. And then I'm going to start a quest on the team narrative component. And this is really cool. You'll see that every player in the game will start the quest because they're all sharing that team component, right? Oh yeah, all I forgot was you need to put the team in the levels so that the players can grab access to it. So if we hit play now, you can see when the quest starts, it actually started it for both of the players. So we're actually doing the quest together. And just to prove to you that this works, let me take the bow on this player, and you'll see that the quest will update for both players. That's because we're sharing the quest, which is pretty sick. Very, very cool feature of the shared quests. I really love them. There are some caveats here, like I need to take the bow to Jeff and Bob here, and the problem is they don't ask me if I have the bow. Even though I've started the quest, they're supposed to ask me where the bow is. Why is their dialogue not working properly? Well, this is a bit of a gotcha. If you open up their dialogue, it checks if the quest is in progress, right? The problem is, this is checking if your player has started the quest, but our player hasn't. Our team has started the quest. And so what you need to remember to do is if the quest is shared, you need to click on this, and then check this box that says check shared component. And now it's going to check if the team has that quest in progress rather than our player. And now this will work. We need to remember to do the same here for this one. Now, if your game only had shared quests, you could make this default to true, so you don't have to remember to check this box all the time. But let me just show you that this will now work. So if we find the bow, you can see that we've got the bow. And then if we talk to these guys, you can see how's the quest going. And we can say, I have the bow right here, and it will complete the quest for both players. So you can see that is now working. In fact, if we go into the team and delete that begin quest entirely, we can go back to our master dialogue. We can go to the how are you Jeff here. And here's where it begins the quest. Again, if we just check that use shared component, you can start the shared quest from a dialogue as well. No problems. That'll work fine. So let me actually show you this working. So if we run up to these guys, how are you? I'm going to say I'm great. And they're going to offer me the quest. If I say sure, I'll help, it'll start the quest for both players because I've checked that share component. And now my friend here could find the bow. Now, you'll notice that even though this player found the bow, if you really wanted it so that only the player that got the bow was able to hand it in, you would have to write like a little bit of code to do that. So you're going to have to like do a bit of blueprinting here and there depending on the needs of your game. But you can see the shared quests are pretty damn awesome. The way that the shared narrative component works is actually really simple. It might seem complicated. Oh, team quests, it's this big complicated thing. But it's actually really simple. The way it works is when I find the bow on my player, my narrative component here finds the bow, right? The narrative task comes through and it finds the bow. But then narrative, because I have a shared narrative component, it will tell my team narrative component that it found a bow as well. And therefore it will update the quest for my entire team. So it's actually not that complicated. It just forwards your solo narrative tasks onto the team one. I also got someone asked in the Discord, and you guys probably already know how to do this, but if you don't, I want to show you how to remove a dialogue option if the player's already selected it before. It's very similar to the thing we did here with Jeff, how he'll say, I already told you if you asked before. So what you do is, let's say that the player should not be able to select not so good more than once. If the player selects this dialogue option, we want to remove it in the future so it doesn't appear ever again. Really easy to do. So I've given it the ID Jeff _ not so good. And all you have to do is just add a condition to it. Has completed task. Play dialogue node. Jeff not so good. And then check the not box. So what we're saying here, you can see it actually says, has not done task, play dialogue node, Jeff not so good 1 time. What this is saying is, if you haven't selected this option before, then make it show up. Otherwise, don't make it show up. It's that simple. So you'll see this work now if I talk to these guys. If I say not so good, you'll notice that on the second time round, I won't be able to select that again. You can see it works. So thank you very much for watching. If you have any further questions, please reach out in the Discord. So in the Rubes Discord, there is a narrative channel, and there are tons of people that are providing help, providing support, and I'm in there as well providing support. So yeah, come in here if you have any more questions that weren't covered in this video.